So welcome everyone to this event organized by rootsaction.org. My name's David Swanson. My titles include campaign coordinator for Roots Action. We are going to have 4 speakers, and we are going to have each of them speak for about 8 minutes, and then we're going to address questions to them from the Q&A. So look for the Q&A section, not the chat, not anything else. Not the raise your hand, but the Q&A section of the Zoom console, probably at the bottom of your screen, and put your questions in there at any time during the event, and we will get them to our speakers at the end. We are privileged to have 4 terrific presenters to get this started. The first of whom is Katrina vanden Heuvel, who is the editorial director at The Nation magazine, which you should be reading. I assume most of you are. And she is also a columnist for the Washington Post. Katrina vanden Heuvel.
Thank you, David. And thank you, Norman and Roots Action, for organizing this, and great to be on with Anne. You know, we meet tonight, perhaps in the most dangerous moment of U.S.-Russian confrontation since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're actually closer to war than we've ever been. And what is imperative is that we find a way to diffuse this crisis. The Ukraine crisis demands a political and diplomatic resolution. The U.S. has no significant national interest in Ukraine. National security interest. What it does have a national security interest in is dealing with existential climate crisis, with severe global inequality, with racial divisions, and with the costs of war, 800 bases, and finding a way to renew our diplomatic understanding of crises. No U.S. president is going to send U.S. men or women to Ukraine. The proxy war, however, that is emerging and has emerged in the last months, year, is very, very dangerous. I talked to Anatol Lieven, who writes for The Nation, and did a very important piece on Ukraine a few months ago. Ukraine, the most dangerous problem in the world. He thinks the massing of troops and the U.S. sending troops to the Baltics and East European countries is very dangerous, but possibly a bargaining chip. What's truly dangerous are the shipments of weapons and the advisors who are going to Ukraine, and the tripwire, the accidental tripwire that could result. Now, what's extraordinary is that in these last weeks, we've learned about the fact, so many have learned, that NATO has moved up to Russia's borders in these last months, year, and that there have been provocations. Nuclear bomber planes have been flying close to the Russian territory, 12 miles away. And there have been all kinds of basing of weapons in these last months and years. And that the media has not covered that and underreported that is in sync, it seems to me, with the fact that we haven't learned much in these last years about a fateful decision of NATO expansion. I mean, when you look at the escalating reasons and the escalatory reasons for what we're witnessing now, it really, the original sin was 1990. And I think you've heard about this in the last months, and many of you know this history. But the idea that in 1990, when Germany reunified and James Baker and George H.W. Bush told Gorbachev NATO would not move, quote, 1 inch eastward, has been violated again and again, and particularly by George W. Bush, who in 2008 fast-tracked Ukraine and Georgia. And I think it's in that original sin, which, by the way, was debated. The expansion of NATO was a healthy debate in 1997. People like Paul Nitze, Richard Pipes, and senators, not Joe Biden, but opposed NATO expansion, which differs so significantly, it seems to me, from our landscape today, where any questions about what the alternatives were in 1990 have been put on a back burner that we can barely find. I mean, there were alternatives that were not militarizing the US-Russian relationship, that could have been multilateral regional agreements. But the militarization of the relationship began certainly in 1991. And the view that America was triumphant is a view that Ambassador Jack Matlock criticizes often, because no one won the Cold War. We certainly didn't. But we had Russia on its knees in the 90s, and that moved NATO expansion significantly. We've just exited Afghanistan, and I think this is playing a role. George Packer, not my favorite writer on foreign affairs, has a piece in the Atlantic about the moral disaster of exiting Afghanistan. I think there were many moral disasters around Afghanistan, but the, quote, ineptitude of leaving is to be marked not by George Packer essays in the Atlantic, but by the Costs of War project at Brown University, which has documented 5.6 trillion. And I raise this because as we think of other military skirmishes, conflicts, wars, $5.8 trillion. And the international community, such as it is, can't raise 5 billion at this moment. And so we lose sight of the costs. I think if any country goes to war, which should always be last resort, there really needs to be like an escrow account that is demanded that be put in place. But that's the original sin. Now, the problem at the moment is there's a delusion at the heart of this debate about Ukraine, because Ukraine really should be non-aligned and a bridge between East and West. It could not join NATO even if it wanted to, which it does at this stage. Well, there's a division. Ukraine is a divided country. It has become a geopolitical proxy war between East and West. But the fact that Ukraine could not join NATO because of its territorial, the lack of a territorial wholeness is a very serious factor. And the fact that the United States government is saying such, kind of hysterical things that even the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, is asking Biden to slow down. The fact that we have so many armchair warriors in our media gives it a drumbeat every day, as if we don't do something, we will have failed. But I write this week in the Washington Post about different agreements that have moved the situation very slowly, like the Minsk agreement. Germany, France, Ukraine, Russia have met over the last week. They spent 8 hours in marathon negotiations trying to find some way to make the Minsk agreement, which is really about demilitarizing Ukraine, autonomy for Eastern Ukraine, language protection, whole and sovereign borders guaranteed, Russia, separatists leave. But these are agreements that will be renewed again in Berlin in marathon talks. So I think more attention paid to that, more attention paid to the resolution of this crisis so that war, conflict doesn't become the central answer. NATO, I would just say, is not a coffee klatch. It's a military institution, which when the Soviet Union ended and the Warsaw Pact disappeared, as I said, there were many alternatives. And I think we should try to revive the sense of a different security architecture and not leave it to the Council on Foreign Relations or the Antony Blinkens of our time, because this is an opening. And I don't think the European alliance, such as it is ready to go along with what the United States seems to be pushing. So I just would end in saying two things. One is that Cold Wars are lousy for progressives in all countries. I've been going to Moscow since 1978. I have worked with many independent media groups and feminist groups. It is a bad time now. I mean, there is a repressive quality, and some of that is a tit for tat. Some of that closes space for dissent, for discussion, for debate. And we see it in our own country. Russiagate was a squandered 5 years, it seems to me. The foundational elements of Russiagate have imploded. And the media, I'm not going to get into the kind of armchair warrior piece, but there is a lack of context and a historical amnesia that contributes to a perspective, and in this case, I'm going to talk about Moscow, that has no memory of what is at the root, in a sense, of this crisis. It's also always Putin. There are different forces in Russia, and there's a hard right, there are hawks in both countries ascended. And Putin, I have no brief for, but de-democratization began under his predecessor, Yeltsin. And now we're witnessing, at least there's an understanding about the fact that you can't just do Putin. I don't remember ever understanding that you don't have a country with other forces, military intelligence, as we do, and as our screens are too often given to. My point is that we should have a robust debate in this country, but for too long, it's been one hand clapping. And that's very dangerous because demonization leads more easily to war, and lack of debate, lack of discussion, and cold wars can lead to hot wars. So I think we need on this call to think hard about how we can push non-military solutions and force a media in our own communities and more generally to open up to others speaking with experience and analysis and compassion for different points of view. So I'll stop there, but I thank you for listening. I'm part of this panel.
Terrific start. Thank you, Katrina. Katrina vanden Heuvel is editorial director of The Nation magazine and columnist for the Washington Post. We are to answer a question. The questions are piling up, and we're going to get to them after three more speakers. But to answer how many people are on here, 269 and rising, and to answer who the other speakers are going to be, they are going to be Ann Wright, Vladimir Kozin, and Norman Solomon. Beginning with Ann Wright, who is a retired U.S. Army colonel, a retired diplomat, an author, an activist, not an activist, one of the best activists that we have had for years and years and years. Ann Wright, please go ahead.
Hey, David, thanks a lot. And it's great to be with everybody on the panel. I admire everyone so much for all the work they've been doing over these many, many years. And, you know, with my background of being in the military for endless years and then a diplomat also for half as many endless years. You know, this just frosts me that this crap is going on right now. This may not be too diplomatic language, but Jesus Christ, when you have the country that you're saying we got to go help, and the country's going, wait, no, we don't want your help. You don't understand what we're doing. You know, and that's essentially what the president of Ukraine has said over this last week. President Biden, wait a minute, hold it. You all are going into something we don't really want, and he shouldn't want it because it's his country that's going to get waxed. I mean, you talk about types of military actions that we all know result in endless casualties, civilian casualties. We know what happened in Iraq when, at least in Iraq, they were saying, don't kill us, don't kill us. Bush and crew just went out because they were the enemy. But here you've got supposedly the friends that we're going after. In fact, this is an article that I wrote that came out yesterday in the Honolulu newspaper, U.S. Russia Ukraine dilemma, and I was impressed that the whole page came out because this is the home of one of the unified commands of the U.S. military. It's not the European Command, of course, that's over in Europe, but here the Pacific Command, where the senior leadership of the largest of the military unified commands is headquartered. And I certainly hope they read this, and I hope they send it to their buddies over at the European Command, that, you know, what is happening now, where the U.S. is really taking Russia to task for its 125,000 people that are on the border of Ukraine. And admittedly, I mean, that's a lot of troops. That's a lot of equipment they've moved in there. I think it's probably the largest military, you could call it war maneuver, if it's done by the United States. Of course, it's always called war or exercise, a military exercise. It's a huge number of people, but it's how many people does NATO arrive every year when they have their Defender series in Europe, and they put tens of thousands of NATO and U.S. troops right along the Russian border in all these states that have been poached from the Warsaw Pact by the United States. There's a real reason why Putin and the Russian Federation has kind of laid down their red line, so to speak, that one of the very last of the countries of the former Warsaw Pact, and the largest one, you know, they're finally saying to the West, just don't do this, don't do this. And yet the verbiage that's coming out of the administration from War Hawk Secretary of State Blinken and from, silent Secretary of Defense Austin, which is kind of nice not to have the Secretary of Defense going after the war so much. But Blinken certainly and our president are really have ratcheted up the verbiage on it, and then our media has just taken it and run with it. And as Katrina mentioned, very little information is being given out about the real reason behind the decision of the Russian Federation to mobilize all these people right next to the Ukrainian border. I was in, one of the things that the West always talks about is the annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. And several of us were in Crimea the year after the annexation. It is controversial, that's for sure. But when a group, the citizens, the residents, granted not all of them, because some of them went on back to Ukraine, but the ethnic Russians that were there voted that they wanted to go with the Russian Federation. The amount of sanctions that the West has put on the Russian Federation because of that, and on Crimea itself because of it, is really quite remarkable in the level of animosity that was caused by that annexation. When we were in Crimea, they were telling us that normally Yalta and the Black Sea ports that were a tourist destination for the Middle East, coming from Turkey, going through the Bosphorus states, go up to the Black Sea. 200 ships would usually come in with tourists. It went down to zero, just zero. So the whole issue of first the annexation of the Ukraine, and then the separatist movement that arose in the eastern part of Ukraine, certainly is a challenge, but it's not one to go to war over. We certainly, if we can't figure that out after the last 20 years of what has been done in Afghanistan and to Iraq and what has happened in Syria, if we can't figure out that perhaps there has to be a diplomatic solution to this, that the people we pay to not get us into war have to keep talking about this sort of stuff. I'm out here in the middle of the Pacific. I'm in Honolulu, Hawaii. And as I mentioned, the headquarters of the Indo-Pacific Command is here. And having been also in the military myself, the predictions on the stress and strains on our military for doing two things at once, of sending lots of weapons and probably many more personnel than will ever be admitted into Ukraine, plus the two armadas that the United States has in the Western Pacific, two aircraft carrier groups that are out there that are doing the freedom of navigation to right in China's front yard. The things that are happening with Taiwan, with the United States sending the highest level of diplomats in the 50 years that we've had this one policy, one China policy. And then just this last week, where you have Kim Jong-un kind of doing the 4th of July fireworks with all of these weapons testing. It is a crazy time, and it's time for the temperature to be tapped down everywhere rather than being brought up. So I would certainly urge everyone to get in touch with your Congress people, to bombard the contact list at the White House. The contact there saying no war, no war. We cannot have a war. We've seen the results of these failed, all wars are failed. And to think that at this stage that we have a president that's still saying war is imminent, war is imminent. So it's up to us to get it stopped. And I hope everyone will get after it. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Ann Wright is a retired U.S. Army colonel, retired diplomat, terrific author and activist. We are now at 282 people and rising. Please continue putting your questions in the Q&A, not the chat, not the raise hand, not whatever else, but in the Q&A section, although we already have plenty to fill numerous events, and they cover the full range of perspectives and points of view, and I am eager to ask them. But first, we have two more speakers. Bill, if you can make sure I'm able to share screen. Unfortunately, Vladimir Kozin has been unable to show up in person, and we're going to show an 8-minute video of Vladimir Kozin speaking from Moscow. He is a member of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences, and we will hear what he has to say.
My name is Vladimir Kozin. I'm native Russian and I'm living in Moscow. Currently, I'm a member of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences. I would like to start that we are not very happy with the response that we have received yesterday in Moscow time in the evening on 26th of January in Moscow and subsequently in Brussels, delivered to our ambassador in Belgium. So we are not happy with these two responses, because they are, instead of giving us security guarantees or guarantees on security or for security, this replies gave us guarantees of insecurity or guarantees of danger. Explanation from my side. First, the United States government and NATO alliance do not want to sign two draft treaties submitted to them in mid-December last year. Second, as Mr. Lavrov, Russian foreign minister, publicly stated today, the replies, actually two replies, contain only second-rate issues to be debated. Third, there is no de-escalation of very dramatic situation in area very close to Donbass region. And the war or aggression of Kiev versus Donbass is imminent. Preparations are underway. And the leaders of Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics have stated that the preparations are actually over from the Ukrainian side, from Ukrainian armed forces and territorial defense. So it means that in the future, if nothing positive happens, we will face too long and procrastinated confrontation, suspicion, hatred, and there will be imminent eruption of wars, conventional or nuclear, and later on space wars.
I've seen that Germany has blocked some countries and itself from sending weapons. They've sent helmets and been made fun of. The mayor of Kiev is asking, what will they send next? Pillows. And I've seen that Croatia will not send weapons. I've seen some slightly encouraging remarks from the president of France. Is there any possibility of finding some willingness to make peace among some of these other countries?
Yes, well, we never close the window of opportunity. And I think that many NATO member states actually do remember the famous decision made by OSCE in 1993 when OSCE decided decided to block any delivery of military hardware, arms and ammunition to zones, to areas where there are conflict situations, conflict environment. And this was a very good decision. But unfortunately, too many countries are pouring arms and ammunition to Kiev regime in violation of this 1993 OSCE decision. And it's also sending advisors, consultants, any expertise personnel and trainees to Kiev, means a violation of Article 10th of the Minsk Accord and Article 6 of the International Arms Trade Treaty, which is operational, which is active. So a lot of controversial issues, and unfortunately, no chances. Why Germany assumed this kind of negative stance on sending troops or just ammunition to Kiev? Well, simply they remember Germany's role in the Second World War. They do not want to participate. But unfortunately, all other states who are sending troops and advisors to Ukrainian armed forces are accomplices of this inevitable aggression of Kiev versus Donbass, not against Russia and not against Belarus or Belarusia, because not enough military power to attack us.
Sure.
But to launch aggression against Donbass, that's quite obvious because everything has been prepared. By today, when we are talking, there are 129,000 troops, Ukrainian troops, regular armed forces, and territorial defense units, some kind of volunteers, brigades and formations are not included into this figure. So it's half, nearly 50% of the entire Ukrainian armed forces. So tremendous forces amassed near Donbass, who is incapable to defend itself.
We're over the time we were allotted, but I have to ask, how would Russia respond to an attack on Donbass?
We will help people of Donbass to resist and to wipe out any aggressor units from the Donbass soil. But we will never cross the border, the line of disengagement, the line of control separating Donbass area from the rest of Ukraine. It's not our task. We do not need Ukrainian land. We are number one in terms of territory in the world, so the huge country.
Yes, indeed. Well, we could discuss for hours, but we have to stop. Thank you. Thank you very much.
My pleasure, David. So any time you wish to talk to me, so channel of communications are working. So goodbye, ciao, take care.
Thank you,
no
stay well.
No wars, no aggressions.
No
Peace
more wars.
for everybody.
Thank you.
Security guarantees for anybody, for everybody, all over the world. Goodbye, ciao, thank you, kind regards.
Goodbye, thank you.
Goodbye, cheers.
So thank you to Vladimir Kozin. He is a member of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences, made that video for us in Moscow a couple of days ago. We have one additional speaker. We're now up to 287 people here and questions piling up in the Q&A. Norman Solomon is co-founder and national director of rootsaction.org, as well as an author you should all be reading regularly, and an activist. Norman Solomon, take it away.
Many thanks to everybody making our gathering possible here. Listening to the speakers so far, I was struck by a precept that probably many of you who are familiar with Gandhian precepts are familiar with, that around the table, there's some truth around that table. And a big problem that's been referred to so far this evening is that there are some truths we're just not getting from the US news media or the Congress or the current government US leadership. And part of the problem is simply silence. If you have silence about truth, then that's a form of deception, especially when the truth is crucial. And I just written a piece that is on a few websites, including Common Dreams and progressivehub.net, as well as the American Committee for US-Russian Accord. And the headline was simple to write: US to Russia, do as we say, not as we do. And if you've traveled around the world, you know, if you've talked with people, that doesn't work very well. It's not very convincing when the message through conduct is do what we tell you to do because we're the most powerful country in the world. Generally, people do not buy that. I think it's helpful to briefly look at how we got to this political dynamic where we are now in the United States that has a political foot on the accelerator to keep sending these weapons, to keep deploying troops, to be escalating the rhetoric and the dangers. 5.5 years ago, when Hillary Clinton lost the election to Donald Trump, 24 hours later, in the national headquarters of the Clinton campaign, as documented in the book Shattered, co-authored by a reporter for The Hill, the top leadership of the Clinton campaign talked about how they were going to respond to their loss. And they decided that night to blame Russia. And it's since then that we've undergone an onslaught through varying styles and focuses of a concerted political and media campaign to tell us that Russia is a mortal threat to our country. I recently saw a list of 62 different ways that democracy is under threat in this country: voter suppression, gerrymandering, and all the rest of it. Of those 62 factors, not one of them had anything to do with Russia. But if you remember back to after the 2016 election, there was a logical series of self-examination that the top of the Democratic Party could have engaged in. Was there a problem with Hillary Clinton being so close to Wall Street? Was there a problem with her not campaigning in the upper Midwest? It's a very long list I won't go into. But it was much easier to blame Russia. It's been much more popular with the military-industrial complex. It's been much more popular with the mainstream media. And unfortunately, I have to say that where we were headed for those last 5 years is pretty much where we are now. It's on the precipice of a confrontation between the world's two biggest nuclear powers. And what's past is prologue, but I think it's fair to say that many progressives were taken in. They jumped on the rhetorical war train. We were tempted to believe that so many of our problems stemmed from the Kremlin. We watched Rachel Maddow and we thought that that was a credible view of the world. We thought that the erasure of history was just fine. We thought that NATO's expansion to the Russian border was just a minor detail. And we forgot the role of the United States, its militarism, its 750 bases overseas around the world compared to a couple dozen of Russia's. And now here we are where the imperative, or a couple of the key imperatives, are first to understand and educate where we are, how we got here, and how we can get out of it, how we can move forward away from the nuclear precipice. And one of those key aspects is to, as swiftly and effectively as possible, reach out to what you might call the progressive base, others we know, those who disagree with us, the news media, whether it's a letter to the editor of the local paper or any other outlet, any other media or communications outlet you can think of, through social media, every which way, to reach out with the theme first that the US doesn't get to own this world, but most importantly, that, as the saying goes, war, and especially nuclear war, doesn't prove who is right. It proves who's left over. And in the case of nuclear war, which is where we are currently heading, there would be virtually no one left. That is the overarching reality. Now, some people watching, they might think that, I'm full of it, or Vladimir Kozin is full of it. That's secondary. But those you love are ones you don't want to have their lives snuffed out by thermonuclear war. And that's where the overarching reality is right now. And in terms of action, along with what I mentioned to reach out to everyone we can, is about Congress. Everybody in Congress is elected from somewhere. There are 535 people who need to hear from us, especially constituents contacting each member of the House and both senators from that particular state. Going into the chat right now is a link that if you utilize it and if you share it with others and they utilize it, it will take under 60 seconds to email your House member in Congress and your two senators explicitly as a constituent. It will go directly to them. And if you want to take more time and compose your own message, that's great. That is a link that you could share with dozens and dozens of other people. So the aggregate of people on this Zoom call could result in tens and tens of thousands of constituent emails in the next 48 hours to members of Congress. Will that solve the problem? No, but it's part of what we're going to have to make possible and activate if we're going to turn this around, and we certainly need to put it mildly. I want to close by saying something about diplomacy. We've been hearing a lot from some of the most peace-oriented members of Congress in the last few days about how they support diplomacy. Pardon me, but I'm not impressed. If you'll remember back to the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, virtually everybody in Washington said they supported diplomacy. Colin Powell said he supported diplomacy. Donald Rumsfeld said he did. President George W. Bush said he did. The invocation of how I want to, our Congress wants to, our president wants to pursue all the diplomatic channels, that can be a complete smokescreen unless we get a change in policy. And that's what we need to demand.
Absolutely, we do. Thank you to Norman Solomon, who is the co-founder and national director at rootsaction.org. We can now address questions that have piled up, wonderful questions in the Q&A section. You can keep putting them there, but I've got mountains of them already that I will now address to Norman and Katrina and Anne. I wish we could have Vladimir answering questions here, but that's not going to happen at the moment. Let me combine a few questions that hit on a theme that seems very dear to a number of people in the Q&A, and there's very similar questions. Isn't Russia the aggressor? Isn't Putin the aggressor? Isn't Putin threatened by Ukraine's democracy? Isn't Russia? So one question is there always one the aggressor? Another is, isn't Russia the aggressor as proven by its domestic shortcomings, its lack of freedom of the press and so forth? And doesn't Putin consider Ukraine not a real country? Isn't all of this the heart of the problem that you all are blind to? Who would like to take that first? No one is eager. Katrina, I think your mouth is moving. Can we unmute everybody somehow, please?
So it takes, as Reagan and Gorbachev said, it takes two to tango. And I don't mean to make light of it, but the NATO expansion to Russia's borders, this is not a new development. This has been underway since at least 2008, maybe 2004. And there have been other, as Norman spoke of, the triumphalism of America after the end of the Cold War or the end of the Soviet Union contributed to Iraq, contributed to a sense that this was a unipolar world and America was the indispensable nation. And in that, in 2007, and I'm just going to, this is, I think it's the turning point in Putin's relationship with the West. And it was a warning at the Munich Security Conference, which is a very important event. Putin gave a speech, which, was really just warning those, particularly in the front row, McCain, Lieberman, Merkel, that this was no longer a unipolar world, that Russia was no longer on its knees, as Clinton and, Strobe Talbot had expected it would be, and that it was consistent with that there be an understanding about spheres. Spheres may seem outdated, and they are, and we should work to unfreeze frozen conflicts and to do so with international multilateral institutions. But the United States had bet that it could roll over Russia forever. And in that, I think you see what is happening in the part of the world where there is such asymmetry. For Russia, Ukraine is an independent country. It is divided. It's a civil war, as Vladimir Kozin alluded to, where you have the West basically shooting at those in the East as not brothers and sisters. So I think the danger of geopoliticizing the civil war takes two. And I have a hard time seeing Putin as the aggressor. I think the military is an aggressive force, but there's a history here that needs to look at how there's been escalation on both sides. And finally, those who study Russia will make a case, and I won't do it right now, but I'll set out the idea that de-democratization, and Gorbachev was the great democratizer, open doors, which we've squandered, and redefined security as human security, was a really anti-militarism. But it was Boris Yeltsin who began to de-democratize Russia by looting the country, shooting on an elected parliament in 1993. And Putin's first act in office was to give immunity to Yeltsin's family because of the corruption. And so I just put that in context. I think it's too simple to say aggression, but one doesn't want military troops to define our future in any way, any country.
Well said. Norman or Ann, did you want to speak to that? We have plenty more.
Well, really briefly, I think this is sort of an offshoot of those profound points. We have a huge, maybe even almost unprecedented gap between what we're hearing from members of Congress and the mass media on the one hand, and public attitudes, because even after all this barrage from both quarters in the last weeks, you look at the polling in the last few days, Data for Progress, some of the top pollers in the country, they find that an overwhelming majority of the people in this country want to compromise over this issue. They don't want to go to the ramparts and fight.
Well, and I'll just add, the surveys that are being done in Russia, for God's sakes, they had 27 million of their own people killed in World War II. They got their butts kicked just like we did in Afghanistan. They don't want war. They don't want war. The Ukrainians don't want war. We don't want war. So why the hell are we where we are? That's the stupid politicians that just keep going after it, and the people that are making the big bucks of selling, what was it, $500 million worth of U.S. weaponry was delivered to the Ukraine. So it's the big money guys. And I think Katrina alluded to it, all these armchair warriors that just keep their job on the networks. They've got to hype it up. So they're doing it on steroids for sure.
There are a lot of questions in the Q&A about NATO. Some of them I think we have already answered. Were promises violated about not expanding NATO? Yes, of course. Should NATO have been dissolved when the USSR collapsed? Yes, of course. But there are also questions a little bit off the mainstream of questions. Is the solution to add Russia to NATO? Isn't NATO expansion voluntary and a right and defensive in nature? In other words, oughtn't we to shut up about it as being somehow objectionable?
You need to fulfill certain criteria, which is why I alluded to the territorial integrity of Ukraine. And this is not Russia. This is a civil war. Again, part of the agreement I spoke of would demand that Russian separatists who, by the way, are more extreme than the Kremlin government. They want to build a republic in Donbass. And, but I think, it's not a coffee klatch, as I said. You have to fulfill certain criteria. You have to buy certain kinds of weapons. There's a term called interoperability. And, there's a reason there have been lobbies for NATO expansion. I think countries should have every right to join. Again, Ukraine could not become a member right now. But on the other hand, NATO is a military institution. It is a militarized institution. So shouldn't there be, and shouldn't after the end of the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, there was on order a different an alternative, which was multilateral, regional, non-military. So I keep coming back to that and thinking, never give up on alternatives, never say never. There's a lot of talk about how dangerous it would be if the European alliance split or became more independent. I think that would be healthy if France and Germany, which we've seen now, are more suspect about sending weapons and things, and found more tradition in an independent Europe. And if I have to hear about the international rules of the liberal world order one more time, that is such an expression of my rules, my road, my way. And I think we can do better.
If I could just add to what Katrina said, this whole issue of NATO, it's been going on now for 60 years. When I was in the military, I actually was assigned to one of the NATO subcommands called Allied Forces Central Europe, which was and still is up in the Netherlands. And if you think there's armchair warriors here in the U.S. that are on TV, well, NATO has its own little bevy of TV personalities and international politicians from all the European countries that may move from their national governments where they've been Secretary of Defense or Foreign Minister or whatever, and then all of a sudden they arrive in a very lucrative position, which is a part of NATO, it's a really good life for them. All sorts of amenities, and they don't want to give it up. So there's no way in the world that they will vote to dissolve something that is such a financial and social prestige sort of thing to them, which is kind of hard to believe in some way, but it's actually true. It's a long established pig trough.
The rule-based order, I think, was originally called "We Rule with Our Bases, so we give the orders," and they shortened it a little. There's a number of questions, Norman and everyone else, related to media, including why is there not a single voice for peace anywhere in the mainstream media? Isn't the mainstream media, U.S. media, the worst player in this whole situation, worse than the weapons dealers, the countries, the governments? Is Russiagate a part of why the media is so bad right now on this topic? And was there an effort to restart a Cold War that has succeeded?
We can remember, and we may feel jaded now, but we can remember a time when the exclusion of dissenting voices was not as bad. In the lead up to the Iraq invasion, once the October 2002 vote came down, the space really narrowed. But for a while, there was a vigorous debate, partly because of the grassroots, partly because the Congress was somewhat split. It's much worse now. We have almost the total exclusion through and with and in mainstream media of any other perspective, where the only viewpoint from the Russian perspective is occasionally some sound bites from a Russian official, which reinforces the idea that it's us versus them. I certainly think that the agenda building of the last 5.5 years, often called Russiagate, has contributed to this. And let's face it, there was tremendous money to be made by jacking up the budget, and there was a belief, the military budget, and there was a belief that this was a winning political issue. And I would love to talk with people like Adam Schiff and others who encouraged our delusion that somehow beating on an anti-Russia drum for years would help elect Democrats in 2020. And if you go back and you look at the poll-tested and poll-guided messaging of Biden in the closing months of the 2020 campaign, Russiagate just wasn't on the screen. It wasn't a blip on the screen because people weren't interested. They were interested in healthcare, education, housing, a future for their families and people they cared about.
They were opposed to endless war. And if I might just add, my late husband, Stephen Cohen, was slurred and stigmatized for his views, alternative views about US-Russian relations. And I think in that stigmatization of alternative views, you close down debate and you help contribute to a Cold War and to the landscape for a Cold War. So I think it's shameful. I would add, in the course of Russiagate, and we always talked about this, it wasn't just the lack of analytical knowledge. You had Clapper, you had Brennan, you had those who have not been characters to trust in US history suddenly being lionized on TV. And for a new generation, they were treated as the arbiters of truth and integrity. And then also there were military, not all military people are bad, but there are people who came on who were involved in the defense companies they had been on the board of, and they don't disclose. So there's this non-virtuous circle, but I do think the stigmatization was shameful. And so.
One comment in the Q&A, I will just quote, Stephen Cohen was a great man. I just wanted to follow up quickly on the people aren't interested in the Russiagate issue because they're interested in their wallets and so forth. It all strikes me as kind of begging a question. I mean, I always want to know, are they not interested because they don't believe the nonsense about Russia deciding the election and owning Trump as a slave? Or do they believe that stuff, but they just really don't care, which seems to me like I would care if I believed that stuff. Do we know why people are not interested at all?
I do think people are interested in the world. I mean, I think trade is a huge issue, but on Russiagate, all the polls, as Norman knows, the surveys did not show, it showed it to be as too much of our foreign policy as an elite project designed to forgive an elite which had failed to win. And as Norman began to, you could tick off 40 different reasons. But I also think this is, Trump, incoherent, vile, all the words we want to say, but he did win 60 counties in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, I believe. And when two analysts, pollsters went back, it showed that the lead issue was Trump saying, which he didn't do, end endless war. And I think that is a place where you really find people and find them where they're at on that issue and then build out. So.
We have questions also about the role played by different forces, both in the U.S. and NATO and Russia. In the U.S., there's a question: aren't weapon sales a key driver here and a key driver of the expansion of NATO to create weapons customers out of Eastern Europe? And how would we go about blocking the flow of weapons out of the US as well as out of the UK and France and elsewhere?
Well, I'll mention one thing that Trump did that I don't like, but he kept demanding that all the NATO countries up their budget to pay more money into it, so the US would have to pay, I guess, less. But he certainly didn't discourage them from buying US weapons. Sadly, I believe the statistics are that the sale of weapons is America's greatest export, which is a sad state of events for us.
With opponents like that, why would NATO need friends,
Bill Hartung is terrific on this issue. It's a big area. and the weapon sales go up. Russia's high too. France is traditionally high. And how to begin to convert. Norman Solomon, who's done some great work on banning ICBMs, and not just Norman, but generals and Bill Perry. And he sent an article the other day. Was it from the Daily Montanan? That was important. It was people in a community where ICBMs have been, put down, who wanted to find more productive jobs and find alternatives and get rid of the ICBMs. And I think that's something to build on around the country and not rely on the missile caucus in Congress.
Yeah, when I think of the taboos of the mass media in this country, especially in this crisis, and of course it could be a long list of taboos, one of them is the connection between this brinkmanship from Biden and the risks involved and the existence of these essentially first strike prone weapons, the ICBMs that are there at launch on warning, 400 of them in silos in the US, virtually untouchable as an issue to discuss in any way in the US media. And then another, which we've already alluded to, but worth mentioning, I think, again, the taboo about the expansion of NATO. You can watch hours and hours, days and days of cable about this crisis on TV and read the great supposed newspapers. And if there's ever any reference to the expansion of NATO, it's ahistorical. It doesn't tell people what's in the National Security Archive documenting this pledge that was made by then Secretary of State Baker back in 1990. And the other we've just talked about a little bit is money. A taboo in the US mass media to talk about the tremendous amount of profits being made for war to sell these weapons.
Norman, if I might, we saw the four chiefs of the big defense companies the other day talk about how they were raking it in and how the new security strategy and the nuclear posture review is coming in February had downgraded counterinsurgency, which didn't bring them enough money or profits, and moved up Russia and China as the two big targets and threats. So there is an alignment with some of what we're seeing with the defense military, well, it's military and industrial defense industry, or as Ray McGovern says, Mickey Mac. Anyway, I can't. But I don't want to be too reductionist because I think there are other factors, but it's certainly a big one.
Well, and if I could mention that Veterans for Peace has its own nuclear posture review that is excellent and calls for, essentially what we all want, which is get rid of the nukes, get rid of that danger to us. I will say that, we've had a lot of citizen activism on trying to get rid of nuclear weapons, and all of them have ended up in federal prison, all to their credit. I can remember Kathy Kelly sitting on the top of a ICBM lid, I guess it was, she got thrown in the clink. And then we've had all the people that have gone to the nuclear submarine bases in Georgia. We've had people that have climbed over Oak Ridge to go down into the Oak Ridge complex. And the three of them were in federal prison for 1.5 to 3 years. So we have some very brave people who are willing to put their lives on the line, so to speak, on this issue. Not everybody wants to do that, but we all have the capability of at least, raising hell with this as your congressmen and women are up for election. I mean, this is the time to do it. Go after them big time.
Just to spell out Ray McGovern's acronym, which really seems to be catching on, MICIMAT is the Military Industrial Congressional, I'll add in so-called intelligence think tank complex. Leaves out defense because, there doesn't seem to be much defensive about it.
One called the War Department. It was renamed defense at some point in the
1947, in fact, and it was a Secretary of War and a Department of War until then. There's another question related to activism, and that is the U.S. government didn't care about massive opposition to invading Iraq. I would quibble with that a little, but I take the general point. Why would it care now? I would, of course, reply that it's cared on Syria and Iran and other wars that have not happened that nobody ever remembers or puts down in the calendar, but also, where is the opposition? I mean, we were out in the streets denouncing people for lying about a country having nukes. Now there's a country full of nukes. The US government isn't even mentioning them, and we're not in the streets. What the hell's going on?
David, in 1982, there were 1 million people in the streets in Central Park. And it led a few years later to the abolition of an entire class of nuclear weapons for the first time, intermediate nuclear INF. I think with the end of the Soviet Union, there was a view that nukes weren't as dangerous, or which is wrong. And so there was very little. The nuclear security architecture has been unraveled since 2002, the ABM, and then there's what can people do? That's an important part of it, but they can, as Anne said, and there's also the global treaty for abolition of nuclear weapons. But I do think the threat level came down. And of course, in these last years, Putin, for many reasons, has been rightly, in some cases wrongly, been treated like, demonized. And so you had a lack of progressives, and you didn't have progressives. Norman could speak to this. You had a sense that Putin was Trump and Trump was Putin. It got all Alice in Wonderland dangerous. So I think we have to focus and keep our eyes on the prize of not only reducing, but beginning to get rid of nukes, but it's been made harder.
Where we are is in a deep hole politically and maybe culturally. And in terms of being in the streets, quote unquote, a bit of a factor is COVID. It's not perhaps the main factor. A lot of our work is going to be online and digital. And, all of the groups represented here, American Committee for US-Russia Accord, rootsaction.org, Anne does great work with Code Pink. We're working as much as we can on the ground, but as a practical matter, we're online. And so please go to all those websites and get involved. I do want to say that part of the messaging from the Warhawks is to tell us that no matter what we do, it won't make a difference. And Dan Ellsberg tells the very important historical fact that in October, November of 1969, and I remember I was a teenager then, it was very cold outside, November 15th, close to 1 million people were marching past the White House. And Richard Nixon was, as we now know, planning seriously to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam. And after he saw the outpouring of protest, he changed his mind.
Well, and if I could say, we always, COVID, it's tough. We can't do this or that. Well, just look back, a year ago, Black Lives Matter. There were a lot of people that hit the streets on that. Put on your mask and let's go. And that's really what we have to do now. We've got to show visibly, physically, that we do not want more wars.
Some of the but isn't Russia the aggressor questions in our Q&A, as everywhere else on earth, refer to Russia being set on invading Ukraine for the second time, and other questions about the illegitimacy of the vote in Crimea. Would one or more of you like to speak to this? I mean, the line we get in the general US media is very much that Russia is set on invading Ukraine, and we know this because it's done it before. This would be the second invasion. Can we talk about that?
I could say something about Crimea. Crimea belonged, Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, gave it to Ukraine on his birthday in 1953. And Ukraine is, was a part of Russia for over 200 years, almost older than we are. But I said earlier about frozen conflicts. Ideally, if there was trust, you'd have a UN or international monitored vote, a referendum, and not just in Crimea, which is often referred to as the only country whose borders have been violated. I mean, you can look at Kosovo, you can look at Iraq, you can look at Sudan and Western Sahara and Palestine and Israel. I mean, the border situation is not so pretty. But Crimea is a difficult issue. On the other hand, I do think it could be, if there was some trust. It's not part of the agreements I spoke about, the diplomatic. It's been put off the table for future. But it's not. It should be resolved in different ways.
I mean, it seems better to have elections without foreign troops.
Absolutely.
States,
Well, foreign troops or monitors. I mean, we used to call for, Jimmy Carter. I admire, the best living ex-president. I think he was always part of international vote monitoring. And at one point, every columnist at The Nation said we should have international vote monitors, and we should. I mean, that was after Florida 2000. And if you saw James Baker in Florida 2000, not to digress, you understood why Gorbachev did not get a promise he could bank on.
But not a single critic of what's gone on in Crimea has ever proposed what you just proposed, a revote, because I think everyone knows what the result would be.
Yeah, but that's part of but could be something that is done in other frozen conflicts, of which there are quite a few around the globe. But the UN has been so dismissed in ways. It is a flawed institution, but it's a valuable one that could be mobilized.
In fact, there's another question in the Q&A. Has the UN Security Council prevented the sending of UN troops to help? And I would add, would such troops help something? There's also a question, what is the role of the OSCE? So any of you want to comment on what the role might be of any of these organizations?
Well, before we get to that, let me just mention that when we were in Crimea, the people that we talked to said, most of us were ethnic Russians. There were some Ukrainians, and of course the indigenous Tartars were there.
Absolutely.
They said the Ukrainian government was treating us really badly. They weren't giving us the resources we needed really for taking care of education, for roads and all that. They were requiring that no more instruction in Russian. It had to be in Ukrainian. And I think the same thing happened in the eastern part of Ukraine. They were fed up as being ethnic Russians because there was kind of, a divide in the country. Ethnic Ukrainians kind of over here, the ethnic Russians there. And they got tired of it. And that's where this whole thing has kind of come about. It was like, well, in Crimea, they had a plebiscite. They voted. In Donetsk, they're fighting over it. So there's a lot to it.
Let me just say why context and history is so important. Anatol Lieven, I mentioned earlier, he was talking to someone the other day, a reporter, I think for CNN, about Sevastopol and the base there. And they talked about a number of things. And he said to Anatol, which side did the Soviet Union fight on in World War II? They were looking at battlefields in Crimea where there were some of the most extraordinary killings. And so I'm just raising that because I think there's so much history. Crimea is in a void, as are other issues, that history may not sway you, but it's worth thinking about that question.
There's a new Netflix movie called Munich where the horrible original sin of appeasement is transformed into the brilliant delay maneuver that allows the building of a better British military, which of course decides the war. The quality of the British military decided World War II because there wasn't anybody else involved really very much. So this is what
Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, they write sort of as if, America did win in the quote in the Pacific, but they write as if the Red Army loped through, just happened to be by and checked in anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think we're lucky if people know which side it was on.
Let me add one more thing. When we were in Crimea, the whole issue that Russia invaded Crimea. Well, they didn't invade it. They were already there through the agreement that was had about the Black Sea Fleet, the Southern Fleet, that the Ukrainian government had an agreement with the Russian Federation that, yes, a certain number of Russian troops would be stationed there. There were a certain number of warships that were there. The people we talked to said there was not one shot fired with Russians coming in invading us. There was a plebiscite. Nobody held their guns to our head. They were already there because they're part of an agreement. But they were there.
Yes.
I know we're heading just about to wrap up, but I'm noticing a lot in the chat, and a few folks feel that this is a one-sided discussion. And let me say that whatever you think about this issue, whichever side you think is, quote, more or less correct, you probably don't want a nuclear war. And underneath all this, we have that question. And so we have the challenge to organize. And I will just go back to this point. Every member of Congress is elected from somewhere, and they need to hear from us.
Yeah.
So whether you think Russia's demands are outrageous or perfectly reasonable, exactly what the US would demand if there were a Russian missile in the Western Hemisphere, what happens if the US refuses all of them, with military being built up in Ukraine, on the edge of Donbass, and in Russia, on the edge of the same region? What does Russia do? What possible outcomes are there here, and what should we be doing to add to those possible outcomes?
I respect the callers who feel that this is not, we're not of very different, we have different perspectives and different views, but there's room for this kind of conversation from time to time, considering if you turned on MSNBC right now in a segment about Russia, Ukraine, US crisis, you would have a far more radically aligned, disciplined, one-note conversation. So I'm happy to go on with Anne and even Evelyn Farkas, but you don't get invited because they don't want a dissent. Of course, there are different issues we could bring up about Russia. Poverty, the shutting down of different organizations because of the Foreign Agent Act, which the fact that Memorial, an extraordinary organization designed to assist victims of the Gulag and their families, has had legal issues. But that's we could have that discussion. But as Norman said, it's still at the end of the day, you're not condoning, but you're trying to find a way to preserve civilization. And the nuclear issue is certainly paramount. And we're in a moment of crisis we haven't seen, I really don't think, since '62 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's very dangerous and it's perilous. So I think one has to find, to think in 2 or 3 different tracks as we deal with this crisis.
What time were we trying to wrap up, Norman? You suggested we were out of time.
I think approximately now. Of course, it's something that we want to continue. As I mentioned, we have the necessity to organize, and the digital technology allows us to be in communication through the groups that I referred to. So that's, this has to go on for days and weeks to hopefully resolve this crisis in a good way.
Any final remarks any of you would like to add before we do wrap up?
I would hope people might not only subscribe to thenation.com, The Nation, but please go to the website usrussiaaccord.org. It's the American Committee for US-Russia Accord, which is very concerned with just presenting different views, different perspectives, and having a dialogue and engagement with the issues of this crisis time and others.
I would just add, if you don't have in your city something planned to hit the streets, then plan it.
Yeah.
Get moving. Let's go do this. Get your old signs out, dust them off. No war on Iraq, no war on Iran. Okay, no war on Russia, no war on China, no war on anyone. But let's get them out there. Thank you.
And I should add that in a few hours, there'll be a statement released signed by more than 100 different US organizations calling for not only diplomacy, but for the US government to recognize the problem that NATO's expansion has been. And if you'd like more info on that, please go to rootsaction.org tomorrow, and we'll send you an update on what you can do about it.
And I would add that there are proposals for events everywhere on February 5th. Organized locally, do events on February 5th. There are event calendars, worldbeyondwar.org/events, and many others. And there is a big online event on February 5th. You can find it at popularresistance.org and many other places. And yes, to the many questions, is this being recorded? Will there be a video? Yes. Go to rootsaction.org to follow up and get on Roots Action's email list if you want to know about this and similar events, and donate to rootsaction.org if you want us to be able to continue to do things like this into the future. So thank you for all of the terrific questions and comments, and thank you to our wonderful speakers, Vladimir Kozin, who appeared by video, Ann Wright, Norman Solomon, and Katrina vanden Heuvel, and to Bill Lackemacher for helping make this work.
And thanks to you, David.
Yeah.
Thanks to you, David. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.
Participants.
Yay.
Yeah. Okay.